Welcome back to the deep dive. We're continuing our journey through the Apollo program, and it really has been quite the saga so far.
It really has.
We started with that big overview, then faced the tough lessons from Apollo 1,
Mm-hmm.
and then we saw NASA build back with those crucial uncrewed tests, Apollo 4, Apollo 5, and Apollo 6.
Right. Each one was a step. Apollo 4 testing the huge Saturn V, Apollo 5 proving the lunar module could fly on its own, Apollo 6 the final uncrewed checkout despite some hiccups.
Exactly. And you can really feel how each of those missions, success or even the tragedy of Apollo 1, they weren't isolated. They were all building blocks, meticulously placed, leading somewhere specific.
Absolutely. It was like this carefully planned climb. Every review, every test flight we've talked about, it was all funneling towards this next really critical moment. You could almost feel the anticipation building.
Okay, so let's dive into that moment. After all that uncrewed testing, after the deep, hard lessons from Apollo 1, humanity was finally ready to get back into an Apollo spacecraft.
And that return mission was Apollo 7.
Apollo 7, this feels like a huge turning point, a shift from, testing components to actually putting people back in the system.
Oh, it was immense. The pressure, the anticipation.
Yeah.
It's hard to overstate. This wasn't just another launch, it was the return. Astronauts back in an Apollo capsule, the first time a crew would actually fly the redesigned command module.
The one rebuilt after Apollo 1.
The very same. Our sources state it plainly. Apollo 7 was the first crewed mission of the Apollo program, which lifted off on October 11, 1968, for a 10-day flight in Earth orbit.
October 11th, 1968, 10 days in Earth orbit. Wow. You just have to picture at Cape Kennedy, that Saturn IB lighting up the Florida sky. And inside, Wally Schirra, Don Eisel, Walt Cunningham, they weren't just pilots, they were carrying the weight of the whole program, really, proving that Apollo was still alive, still viable after everything.
It was a massive statement, a promise being kept after all that difficult groundwork. Imagine the feeling, not just at NASA, but around the world, seeing humans finally back in that spacecraft, knowing the risks, knowing what they'd overcome.
Yeah, the relief must have been huge. But to really get Apollo 7, we do need to just briefly touch back on those foundations again, particularly the safety aspect after Apollo 1.
Yes.
Because that pause wasn't just waiting, you said it before, it was a complete rethink, driven by this absolute focus on keeping the astronauts safe.
That's exactly right. Apollo 1 was devastating, but it forced this incredibly rigorous reevaluation. We can't, understate the changes made to the command module.
Like the hatch.
The hatch is the most famous example, absolutely. Going from that inward opening, bolted design to a quick opening, outward swinging one. That alone was huge. But also removing flammable materials, changing the cabin atmosphere at launch from pure oxygen.
So not just tinkering, fundamental safety redesigns.
Fundamental. Systemic. It changed everything, how they built the craft, how they tested it, the procedures, even astronaut training. This meticulous re-engineering, this exhaustive testing, it all had to happen before they could even think about putting a crew back in.
It sounds like a cultural shift almost.
It really was. A renewed commitment to safety that had to be proven, demonstrably proven, before they launched Apollo 7. Technology alone wasn't the answer. Safety and rigorous testing had to come first. It was a tough lesson, but essential.
And while all that intense work was happening on the command module, the rockets were also being put through their paces. We talked about Apollo 4, the first all-up test of the big one, the Saturn V.
Colossal is the word for Apollo 4's significance. All up, meaning they lit the fuse on the whole thing, all three stages, just like a real lunar mission. It wasn't just testing parts. It was testing the beast as an integrated system.
Validating the power, the staging.
Exactly. The sheer power, the complexity of the staging sequence, its overall reliability for deep space. And crucially, even though Apollo 4 was uncrewed, its flight test of the command module, even an earlier version, provided vital data. Information about reentry, systems performance that directly informed how they'd fly Apollo 7.
Even though Apollo 7 used the smaller Saturn IB?
Right. Because Apollo 4 built confidence in the whole Saturn family, the whole operational philosophy. It reduced the unknowns for the Apollo 7 crew, even on a different rocket.
Yeah.
It set a baseline. Okay, we can operate these complex systems.
Okay, so Apollo 4 proves the Saturn V's basic capability. Then came Apollo 6. What was its job?
Apollo 6 was meant to be the final stamp of approval, the final qualification of the Saturn V and the Apollo spacecraft together for crewed missions. Basically the last big dress rehearsal before putting people on top for a lunar flight profile.
But it wasn't smooth sailing, was it?
No, it definitely had its moments.
Yeah.
Apollo 6 experienced some pretty serious issues. That Pogo oscillation, basically violent vibrations in the first stage, which could be incredibly dangerous for a crew.
Right.
And then 2 engines on the second stage actually shut down prematurely, and another engine failed to restart in orbit. So,
Yeah.
Not exactly a flawless performance.
Doesn't sound like a final qualification.
Well, here's the thing. While it wasn't perfect, the engineers learned a tremendous amount. They figured out the Pogo problem and fixed it. They understood the engine issues. They even managed to salvage the mission objectives using the spacecraft's own engine. So, paradoxically, overcoming those problems actually built confidence.
Ah, I see. It showed they could handle unexpected issues.
Exactly. It proved the system's resilience and, just as importantly, NASA's ability to understand, diagnose, and fix problems under pressure. So, yes, it was the final qualification, demonstrating readiness even through adversity. That was the signal. The heavy lift rocket was ready for humans.
Okay, so the big rocket is qualified, the command module has been redesigned and safety checked. What about the third piece? The lunar module. That was Apollo 5's job, right?
That's right. Apollo 5's main goal was the first uncrewed test flight of the lunar module, the LM, in space.
And even though Apollo 7 didn't carry an LM,
Its success was still crucial. The LM was this completely different, highly specialized vehicle, the lander itself. Proving it could function, that its engines worked, that it could maneuver in space, even uncrewed, was another major piece of the puzzle.
it showed the whole modular approach worked.
Precisely. Testing these major components, the Saturn V, the CSM, the LM, somewhat independently allowed them to manage the complexity. Knowing the LM test had gone well allowed the Apollo 7 mission to focus laser-sharp on its job, proving the command and service module with a human crew.
Without adding the complexity of testing the LM with people right away.
Exactly. It streamlined the process and reduced the risk for that critical first crewed flight. It was a psychological boost, too, knowing the lander development was also on track.
So all these pieces fall into place. The safety fixes, the rocket tests, the LM test, leading us squarely back to Apollo 7, humanity's return.
The pivotal mission.
Let's nail down those facts again. First crewed mission of the Apollo program.
Check.
Launched October 11, 1968, for a 10-day flight.
A long duration for the time.
And all in Earth orbit.
Right. Staying close to home for this critical checkout.
10 days. You picture Schirra, Eisel, and Cunningham up there, day after day, really putting that spacecraft through its paces, breathing life back into the program.
It was absolutely a high-stakes test flight. They weren't just passengers. They were actively testing everything. Every system, every maneuver, checking how the hardware and software worked together with humans in the loop. The world was watching, hanging on every transmission.
And this goes beyond just checking the hardware, doesn't it? The psychological weight of this mission coming after Apollo 1.
Immense. It wasn't just about proving the engineering worked. It was about rebuilding trust. Trust in the machine, trust in the procedures, trust in NASA's ability to keep astronauts safe. It was a huge validation for everyone involved, from the engineers to the astronauts themselves, shedding the shadow of Apollo 1.
And for those 10 days, they were doing more than just flying straight and level, I assume.
Oh, absolutely. While the sources don't list every single test objective, a 10-day crewed mission implies they were doing exhaustive checks. Testing the manual controls, firing the big service module engine multiple times to change orbit, testing the navigation systems, performing rendezvous simulations.
Practicing linking up with a target, even if the LM wasn't there.
Exactly. They likely used the spent upper stage of their Saturn IB rocket as a target, practicing the techniques they'd need later for docking with the LM in lunar orbit. They were testing life support, communications, waste management, habitability. Living and working in that capsule for 10 days was the ultimate test.
Living and working. Which brings up the human element. We think about the technology, but people are living beings. Were there unexpected things that came up just from having humans inside for that long?
That's where Apollo 7 gets really interesting beyond the pure engineering. The most famous example, of course, is Commander Wally Schirra catching a pretty bad head cold in space.
Oh, right. I remember hearing about that. Stuck in a tin can with a cold.
Imagine. Stuffy nose blocks sinuses in microgravity. It wasn't just uncomfortable for him. It actually led to some friction with mission control. There was a bit of a famous disagreement about whether they needed to wear their helmets during re-entry.
Why? Because of the pressure change?
Yeah, Schirra was worried about the pressure change hurting their ears and sinuses if they were all blocked up. He argued against wearing the helmets, which was against procedure. Ground control wasn't happy, but Schirra, being the commander in space, basically said, "We're not doing it."
Wow. So real-world human issues impacting mission procedures.
Exactly. It seems small, But it highlighted huge questions about crew autonomy, medical issues in space, crew comfort, and how to handle disagreements between the crew and the ground. Beyond the cold, just the experience of managing daily life, eating, sleeping, waste, hygiene in zero-G for 10 days provided invaluable data. Psychological factors too, the confinement, the workload, these weren't things you could fully simulate on the ground.
So it wasn't just about the capsule working, it was about humans working in the capsule.
Absolutely. The synergy, as you said, it was validating every single aspect of that human-machine interface. Life support, keeping them breathing, comms, keeping them connected, navigation, getting them where they needed to go, all operated by astronauts living inside for a week and a half.
And their feedback must have been critical.
Invaluable.
Yeah.
Things the sensors couldn't tell you. How easy was this switch to reach? How clear was that display? How did the procedures feel in practice? That real-time, real-world feedback directly shaped procedures and even some design tweaks for later missions. It was fundamental to that big Apollo goal, developing human capability to work in the lunar environment. You start developing that capability right there in Earth orbit.
It makes sense. So let's talk about the spacecraft itself. The sources mention the three-part spacecraft, Command Module, CM, Service Module, SM, and Lunar Module, LM. Apollo 7 was really focused on that first pairing, the CSM.
That's right. The Command and Service Module, the CSM. Let's break it down. The Command Module, the CM, was the crew's home.
The crew's quarters and flight control section.
Exactly. It's where they sat for lunch, where they lived, where all the main controls were. For Apollo 7, proving the CM was habitable and functional for 10 days was job number one. Could they live in it? Could they control the spacecraft effectively from it? Were the environmental controls up to snuff? Was the human-machine interface logical and usable for that long? All critical questions answered by this flight.
Okay, so the CM is the Living Space and Control Center. Then there's the Service Module, the SM, the powerhouse.
Pretty much. It housed the propulsion and spacecraft support systems. Critically, it had the big SPS engine, the Service Propulsion System. That's the engine they used for major orbital changes and eventually would use to get into and out of lunar orbit.
And Apollo 7 tested that engine.
Oh yes, multiple times. Firing it to prove it worked reliably, that it delivered the expected thrust, that the guidance systems could control it accurately. The SM also carried the fuel cells that generated electricity for the whole spacecraft.
Like the power plant.
Exactly. And the tanks, holding oxygen, hydrogen for the fuel cells, water, all the essential supplies. Remember, when they're joined, they're called the CSM. Apollo 7 proved the integrated CSM could sustain a crew, maneuver precisely, and generate its own power for an extended mission. That was a massive confidence boost.
And the third part, the Lunar Module, the LM, designed to take 2 of the crew to the lunar surface. It wasn't on Apollo 7.
Correct. No LM on this flight. But as we said, Apollo 5 had already done that initial uncrewed flight test. Apollo 7's success with the CSM further validated the overall architecture. It proved the mothership part of the equation worked flawlessly with the crew. It cleared the way to later integrate the LM for more complex missions, knowing the CSM was ready.
Right, one step at a time. Now, to get the CSM into Earth orbit, they used the Saturn IB rocket. You mentioned it was specifically used for Earth orbit flights.
Yes, that was a deliberate choice. The Saturn IB was powerful enough for Earth orbit missions, and crucially, it was already well proven. It had flown successfully before, including launching the uncrewed Apollo 5 LM test.
So less risk than using the giant Saturn V for this first crewed flight.
Exactly. Why introduce 2 major new variables, a redesigned spacecraft and the massive, still relatively new Saturn V on the very first crewed flight after Apollo 1? Using the reliable Saturn IB minimized the unknowns. It let them focus solely on testing the crew and the CSM. It was smart, phased risk management.
Whereas the Saturn V, the monster rocket, was designated for lunar flights.
The beast needed for the heavy lifting, throwing the entire CSM and LM combination all the way to the moon. And its capabilities, as we discussed, were being proven in parallel by Apollo 4 and Apollo 6.
Showing those parallel development paths again.
Everything converging towards the lunar goal, but tested and proven step by step.
And underpinning all of this was the grand strategy selected way back in 1962, Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. Can you unpack that a bit? It sounds complicated.
It was revolutionary for its time. Instead of launching one enormous rocket directly to the moon's surface and back, which would have required something impossibly huge, LOR involved sending the CSM and LM together to lunar orbit. Then, the small LM separates. lands 2 astronauts, performs its surface mission, and then blasts off from the moon using just its ascent stage.
Leaving the bottom part behind.
Leaving the descent stage behind, exactly. The small ascent stage then has to rendezvous, find, and dock with the CSM still orbiting the moon with the 3rd astronaut.
Wow.
Then the LM crew transfers back to the CSM, they jettison the LM, and the CSM fires its engine to come home. It was complex, elegant, and saved a huge amount of weight compared to direct descent.
And Apollo 7, even in Earth orbit, helped prove this concept.
Fundamentally, yes. While it didn't do the lunar rendezvous part, it proved the CSM could be maneuvered precisely by the crew for extended periods. It tested the navigation systems needed for rendezvous. It tested the engine they'd use for orbital changes around the moon. It tested the life support needed for the whole trip. You need a reliable, maneuverable mothership for ELOR to work, and Apollo 7 proved the CSM was that ship. It validated the core vehicle essential for the whole strategy.
Okay, pulling back to the big picture again. How did this one mission, Apollo 7, feed into those grand goals of the whole Apollo program? Let's tick them off first. Establishing the technology to meet other national interests in space.
Apollo 7 was a huge leap here. It wasn't just establishing theoretical technology. It was proving operational technology with humans. The integrated CSM, the life support working for 10 days, the reliable SPS engine firings, the navigation, the communications, the fuel cells providing power, all these advanced systems were demonstrated to work together reliably with a crew. That's a massive technological validation, moving way beyond uncrewed tests.
Okay, goal 2. Achieving preeminence in space for the United States. This seems like a big one for Apollo 7.
Oh, absolutely critical. Remember the context, the space race, the shadow of Apollo 1. Successfully flying a crewed mission, a long crewed mission, in the redesigned spacecraft was a massive statement. It showed resilience, it showed determination, it showed the U.S. was back in the game and capable of overcoming huge setbacks. It was a powerful message to the Soviets and the world, a huge boost to American prestige and confidence.
A major geopolitical win, not just technical.
Definitely.
Goal 3, carrying out a program of scientific exploration of the moon. How does an Earth orbit flight help with lunar science?
Indirectly, but essentially. You can't do lunar science if you can't get there and operate reliably. Apollo 7 proved the spacecraft systems needed for the journey and for operating around the moon were sound. It also gave the crew and ground teams invaluable operational experience refining procedures, understanding spacecraft performance, which was vital preparation for the complexities of lunar missions where the scientific observations would actually happen. You need the operational platform before you can do the science.
Makes sense. And the last goal, developing human capability to work in the lunar environment.
This is where the 10-day duration and the human factors we discussed become so important. Living and working in microgravity for that long, dealing with the confinement, managing the systems, coping with unexpected issues like illness. This was all direct experience contributing to understanding how humans function in space. It provided baseline data on physiological changes, workload management, crew coordination. Knowledge absolutely essential for planning longer, more demanding lunar missions. You learn how to work in the lunar environment by first learning how to work effectively in the space environment itself. Apollo 7 was the first real classroom for that in Apollo hardware.
So it really was this crucial bridge, wasn't it? Taking all the engineering and uncrewed tests and making them real, making them human.
Exactly. It turned theoretical readiness into practical, proving capability. It validated the hardware, the procedures, and the human element altogether. It accelerated the whole program towards the moon.
It's just amazing how much detail exists about these missions. You mentioned the sources, like Apollo by the numbers, a statistical reference.
Yes. Resources like that are incredible. They're described as a comprehensive reference for facts about Project Apollo. And they mean comprehensive.
What kind of stuff is in there?
Well, detailed narratives for each mission, like Apollo 7, but also vast amounts of data tables, covering everything from fuel consumption to cabin temperatures. And crucially, a comprehensive timeline of events from just before liftoff to just after crew and spacecraft recovery.
Minute by minute.
Often second by second for critical phases. So every burn of the SPS engine on Apollo 7, every systems check, every communication exchange, potentially even things like heart rate data, it's likely documented somewhere in that level of detail within NASA's archives, much of which is summarized in references like Apollo by the numbers. It gives you unparalleled insight into exactly what happened, the challenges, the successes.
It's staggering. You could probably find the exact moment Wally Scheer started feeling unwell in those timelines.
Possibly. And Apollo by the numbers is just one example. The whole NASA History series is this monumental effort to document space exploration. It includes reference works, project histories like the Apollo spacecraft, a chronology. It's a testament to how seriously they took recording everything.
So the story we're telling here, it's built on this incredibly solid, documented foundation.
Absolutely. It's not just stories passed down. It's history based on meticulous records, accessible to anyone who wants to dig deeper.
A real treasure trove.
So wrapping up our look at Apollo 7, it really stands out as that essential first crewed step back. Taking all the theory, all the redesigns, all the uncrewed flights, and proving it worked with people. A resurgence.
Indispensable is the word. Without Apollo 7 successfully demonstrating that the human-rated CSM was ready, that the crew could operate it effectively for an extended period in Earth orbit, well, the lunar missions that followed so quickly just wouldn't have been feasible. It rebuilt the confidence, proved the systems, validated the path forward. It was the absolute necessary precursor to Apollo 8 and beyond. And what came next was truly astonishing, that leap beyond Earth orbit. We'll definitely be diving into those missions soon.
Yeah, the pace really picked up after Apollo 7's success.
It really makes you think, though. Apollo 7 often just labeled the first crewed mission. It feels like so much more. It was the moment humanity really took ownership of that spacecraft, proved we could live and work in it. So here's something to ponder. How much of what we know today about long-duration spaceflight, think about future missions to Mars, the challenges of keeping crews healthy and effective for months or years. How much of that foundational knowledge, especially around human factors, crew health, system reliability over time, actually traces its roots back to those seemingly simple 10 days in Earth orbits on Apollo 7? Are the solutions we're designing now still echoing the lessons learned, captured in those meticulous data tables and timelines from way back in 1968?